During the turmoil of the Babylonian exiles, some Jews hop on some boats and flee down to the bottom of the Egyptian Nile to the island of Elephantine. They set up a community there and they hold out. This is their version of exile. Now, they stay there for centuries, even after the Babylonian exile ends. Now, I was first informed about this little island by a Gnostic informant last year, and he explained that the oldest physical evidence we have of the Jewish religion in text comes from this island. Before that, we don't have anything written down. We do have this idea, this implication based on what we're reading, that there's oral traditions that probably stretched back hundreds of years before this. But we don't actually have documents. We have the Elephantine papyri, and then next after that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they're hundreds of years later. So what we have in these documents are critical. They're by far the strongest evidence we have of what Jews were practicing in 500 BC. And when you read them and look at their religious structure, they mention Yahweh. They follow Yahweh. The pagan nationalism that we spoke about before, it's there. They are following this, but they have a temple to Yahweh. Now, we know that that's a big no-no. The temple is supposed to be in Jerusalem. You're not allowed to have another temple. Some people say, well, listen, these guys are all the way to the other end of Egypt. How could they know? The problem is that they sent a letter. They phone called Jerusalem and they said, our temple is kind of a bit ruined. Do you mind if we build another one? And the high priest in Jerusalem said, yeah, sure. Sure, buddies. Go ahead. So Jerusalem knew about this temple. They were in communication. They were only 2 or 3 days away via boat. And Jerusalem was okay with this. This is the hardcore monotheist religion that has one sacred temple in Jerusalem. This is starting to turn into a bit of a problem. But it gets worse again. These guys don't mention Moses. They don't speak about Deuteronomy. They don't even talk about the Torah. They're not aware of this. It's not present. Now, you can make an argument and say, well, maybe they didn't find any religious texts. That's the problem. These are just legal documents, discussions about this temple they're trying to maintain, various letters. But this is a very difficult issue. This is the oldest physical manuscripts we have. People say, yes, the Dead Sea Scrolls are rooted in something older, but physically they've radiocarbon dated those to 200 BC. These things are not as old as what they found in Elephantine. And since the archaeology already suggests that many of the early stories are unreliable, probably fabrications from later in the history of the Jewish people, we have to look at the evidence we have instead of assuming based on the evidence we do not. And this is one of the strongest arguments of the minimalist perspective, that Elephantine is proof that the Yahwehistic pagan religion was still being practiced in 500 BC. And the arrival of Torah Judaism with the formalized text, the only physical evidence we have of that is after 250 BC. So we need to say something happened between those two dates that tell us when a revolution and an innovation took place. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Jonathan Adler looks at the archaeology to try trace when he sees evidence of this formal Torah Judaism being practiced, the actual behavior of normal people. And he says it's not present until the Hellenic Empire of Alexander the Great, and actually the late parts of this as it's falling apart. Now, the way Jonathan Adler comes to his conclusions are very important because he takes a narrow focus. He explicitly says he is not interested in intellectual or elite history. Perhaps the elite were practicing something like Torah Judaism for centuries before they could get the common people to catch up with them. That could be possible. He doesn't care. He says that's not his area of speculation. That's not what he considers good science because it's just saying over and back, oh, well, I believe this, I read history, I believe this. He's a strict archaeologist. So he takes a narrow focus and looks for artifacts so that he can confirm with absolute authority when Judaism was practiced among the common people. Because remember, the intellectual history could be a network of 10 people inside a temple and some elites, whereas the population of 100,000 could be doing something completely different. So he's trying to find out what the population are doing when this is getting followed. That is his criteria, which means that he doesn't speculate, which means that he's very precise. And then all the speculation can be left up to people like me, which I'm sure he'd probably disagree with some of the things I say, but I am building on the back of his hard evidence, so you can study his evidence for yourself. Now, one of the points of evidence he brings up is the use of idols and images and representational art, because, as we know, Deuteronomy commands that you must destroy the graven images of your enemies and you must not follow golden calves yourself, follow the one true God. So the practice of Torah Judaism is not using idols. So if we start in 0 BC at the time of Jesus, when there's lots of Jews around, well, we look at their settlements and we discover that their coins, that statues, none of that is there. They don't use idols. So we can say for certain, around Jesus' time, 0 AD, they are not using idols. They are not using graven images. So that's for certain. Go back 100 years, it's the same thing. You discover that that's not going on. Now, when you start to get to 200 years and 300 years, you start to notice a huge uptick in the amount of idols and the amount of use of animal images and human faces on coins and art, various things like this. Now, it's not like we have an absence of Jewish art before that. Around about Jesus' time, we have loads of Jewish art, mosaics, abstract colors, we have patterns, this type of thing. So they are making art, but they're not using idols. Go back 250 years, and then all of a sudden, they're using idols, they're putting in household idols. We have this problem of polytheism showing up. It seems like they might have been practicing something sort of like this. And their coins even have with things like Greek gods on them. So it seems like they're not taking Torah Judaism very seriously. So we can't really say they're practicing it because they're using idols. They're using this representational art. That drops off at some point, indicating that there's a huge cultural transformation that takes place. The imposition of the Torah laws, the religious laws. So this happens only 200 years before Jesus, which is extremely late from how we would understand it. Jonathan says, one of the things that really stands out is the coins. Judeans were minting coins during quite a number of periods of time. We have Judean coins from the 1st century of the Common Era never depicting humans or animals. The same is true of the 1st century before the Common Era. This is the 100 years after Jesus and before Jesus. So this is very clear. But then when we get to the Hasmonean period, which is this rebellion that takes place at the end of Alexander the Great's empire, the fall of the Hellenic Greek empires, the Judean state breaks away, and this is the Hasmonean, the Maccabee revolt period. What we see is there is the arrival of this new type of coin, which instead of getting an image of a king, of a Judean king, we get a textual portrait. Basically, they write down, big chud badass king was ear on this coin. This is mandated by this. So this means that they're minting coins, but now they're choosing not to use idols. Now we go before this, we go into the 4th century before the Common Era, and every single coin minted by Judeans is displaying animals and even foreign gods like Athena. Jonathan says that we have one coin that has the name of the Judean high priest, Jonathan HaKohen, it says in Hebrew, and in the middle of the coin it has the owl of Athena. So this is representational art coming from someone of high religious authority, which is quite damning to the idea that the priests and the scribes were following the Torah religion and everybody else was not. This is quite undermining of that thesis and quite shocking when you really think about what it means. Now, another point of evidence is immersion pools, because Leviticus is telling the people of Judea, if they want to follow Judaism, they have to ritualistically cleanse themselves. They have to purify themselves. And you can't purify yourself with, just a random pottery pot that you throw water over yourself. You need to specifically do it with stone vessels. And this might be, for example, made of chalk, because Leviticus says that you don't need to worry about stone. Stone does not make you impure. Stone can be used as something that's pure. So therefore, these purity pools that we find in Judean sites are quite common. Wherever you find a Judean site, you're going to find these structures, these purity pool structures. And then in non-Judean sites in the areas around it, they won't have these things. So this is clearly a trait of Judean culture. Now the problem, of course, is again, before Maccabees, before the Hasmonean period, before the fall of the Hellenic Empire, we do not have these pools. So these pools only show up in the 200 years before Jesus. It's quite recent, all things considered. Now, the next point of evidence that he goes into is in dietary laws. When did we find the Judeans are abstaining from pork? Now, there's a bit of nuance with this, because if you want to discover this, you would have to go into a site and see what bones of animals are there, indicating what they're eating. So if there's lots of cow bones or goat bones, we'd be like, right, these guys are eating ruminants. But if there's no pig bones, we'd say, right, they're avoiding pork. And that would mean then, oh wow, they're practicing Judaism. You might think, but that's not exactly true, because there could be other nuances and problems. Maybe, for example, cows get sick and then you can't have them, or maybe cows are too expensive, you're in a desert, it's hard to get grass, or maybe pigs are hard to take care of for whatever reason. So sometimes there can be economical reasons that you avoid foods. For example, in Ireland, we're surrounded by an ocean, but we don't really eat fish that much. Fish is not very popular in Ireland. It's very popular in Spain, but it's not popular in Ireland because we have so many cows. So maybe people in the future will be like, oh, these guys couldn't fish. They're idiots, And this is like, no, we just had such massive cows and so much milk. We didn't need fish. We're not dorks. We're not little fish cooks. We're gonna use our cows like proper Indo-Europeans. Now, this is the same thing. That's not a dietary taboo. That's not a religious law. That's just a sort of pattern of history. So when we look into the data on the appearance of pig bones and the disappearance of pig bones, we do find that, again, in this recent era after the fall of Alexander the Great's empire and the arrival of the Judea period, yes, pig bones vanish, indicating that they're not using them. Now, before that, pig bones do show up, but going back into history, it's not consistent. Sometimes there'll be parts of Judea or certain cities that don't have pigs, and it kind of scatters. Sometimes there will be pig bones, and there'll be Canaanite tribes and Philistines that don't have pig bones and then do have pig bones. And there's all this transformation and morphing. And this is indicating that, yes, there might have been a problem with scarcity of pigs, various things like this, but it doesn't become systematic, it seems, until this Torah era at the fall of the Hellenic empires. So at the end of his book, Jonathan makes his suggestion about how Judaism came into being. He said it was the Hasmoneans who likely adapted or took the Torah and applied it, made it practical. Perhaps the Torah was floating around for a while before that, again among the intellectual elite, but the practitioners, the people who brought it into being, brought the thesis into reality, were these Hasmoneans breaking away from the Hellenic Empire. Now, this is speculative. We don't have any direct evidence of the Hasmoneans getting together and saying, right, this is what we're going to do, this is our plan. But we do have evidence from the political and military sphere looking at what they did as they seized territories and integrated them into this new blossoming Judean state. And this is to do with forced conversions, circumcision in order to get citizenship, and the imposition of Torah law. So it seems like they were going around to their neighbors, conquering them, and imposing this religion upon them, saying, you're going to follow Torah Judaism now, you're going to get circumcised, you're going to follow one God, screw your God is done, and you're going to follow this law. This is an assimilation project in order to absorb everybody into this identity. Jonathan explains that we know, for example, that the Hasmoneans conquered the Edomites in the south of the country. This was a non-Judean ethnic group that worshipped a god named Kyos, and the Hasmoneans conquered them around the year 112 BC and enforced the laws of the Torah on the domains. We would say today they forced conversion on the Edomites. What the sources tell us, and we have textual sources which tell us this, Josephus and others, they tell us that the Hasmoneans forced them to be circumcised and to keep the laws of the Torah. We know that Judah, Aristobulus I, conquered a people in the north called the Etrurians, and he did the same thing. He forced them to circumcise and to keep the laws of Torah. This is the modus operandi of the Hasmoneans as they're making their state. Circumcision and obedience to this Torah was the condition for citizenship. Get circumcised, obey the Torah, or get exiled. And then Jonathan goes on to say, I think it's not much of a stretch to imagine that perhaps the earlier Hasmoneans, let's say Simon or Jonathan or Judah Maccabee, perhaps did this very thing to the Judeans themselves and brought the laws of the Torah to the Judeans, enforced the laws of the Torah on the Judeans themselves. And we would have the emergence of what I call Judaism. Now that's pretty interesting. Now Jonathan being narrow and refusing to speculate beyond this is good because it means that his evidence is quite solid. So this brings us to our next question. Now, why would Alexander the Great's Hellenic Empire be such a stimulus of this? Why would this be such a crucial pivot point? This is only about 250 years before Jesus Christ himself shows up. So this is incredibly late. This is crazy. But the idea here is that the Hellenics, they approached statecraft in a very interesting way. They weren't like the Assyrians, tyrannizing people, breaking their will with terror, ripping off their skin. They actually innovated an awful lot with soft power. They waged a culture war. If you look at modern America projects its globo-homo energy all across the world. It uses Hollywood and McDonald's in order to erode the cultural customs and has absorbed them into the American empire. It's a cultural powerhouse that erodes nationalism, makes nationalism taboo. It says that nationalism is backwards. Oh, your PMFC is turned on and you're a racist. You're a backwards person. You're a bad person. Instead, we want to be open. We want to be this American dream to the world, a liberal world empire that hoovers everybody up inside of it. Now, Hellenism was in many ways the same. Alexander was the master conqueror who took over this incredibly large territory, and he brought with him Greek culture, which had just gone through one of the first revolutions in culture in human history. Nietzsche called the Greeks the first instance, the first step in human culture, where we saw this explosion of theater, philosophy, writing, the genius and love for the body, almost like the first Renaissance is the way to think about it, that set the foundation of a higher standard of human thinking forever, permanently. They progressed mankind forward. So Alexander was quite lucky because as he was conquering, he was bringing with him rational thinking, free thinking, critical thinking, reason, science, glorious, cool new art. It's like cinema showing up, it just mogs everything else that is present. And this becomes the cultural substrate of Hellenism. And instead of oppressing all these like smaller cultures, it actually absorbs them and mogs them, outcompetes them, makes them look weaker and backwards and less intellectual and less intelligent. So you can imagine you're in Judea, and we have these great Hellenic powers presenting to you bodybuilding, the gymnasium, theater, which is like cinema, philosophy, writing, thinking, all this sexy imaginative stuff. And then you've got all these Yahwehists being like, come back into the collective. Turn your PMFC on. Be afraid of these guys. Come and let's hang around in our little temple, in our little hovels in the rural part of our country. And, young people would be like, this sucks. This is terrible. This is backwards. I want to go into the city and find new things and express myself and become an individual. I want to enjoy the globo-homo culture that these Hellenics are presenting me, this homogenized superculture that sits over everything. Now, the Hellenics are genius because they really target the urban elite, which is the thinking administrative center of a culture. So what you see in Judea in this time is writings from people around the Maccabean revolt that are discussing this problem. There's this cultural war taking place, this psychological war taking place, where the rural, backwards traditionalists, the trads, are saying all these yuppies, these traitor libtards in Jerusalem, they're going over to Hellenism. And they try to build a gymnasium in Jerusalem. And they try to, Hellenize Judean culture. And they're like, this sucks. What are we doing? No, we're assimilating. We're getting homogenized. We're getting buck broken by the all-powerful globo-homo empire. And this is an escalating point of tension, but it doesn't break out into war until the Hellenic empires become weak, until they reach their point of collapse like the Assyrians, and the same pattern repeats. The Assyrians were collapsing, and so Josiah can try pull the vassal state of Judea away from himself. And now in this situation, the Hellenic Empire is falling apart, and so the Jews are trying to pull away. The Maccabees want to create and craft their own little space and their own little state. They're turning the PMFC on, and they're trying to purge the libtards, the globo-homo urbanites. They're trying to get rid of them and return back to a trad state. And of course, this requires them to do a little bit of retroactive engineering. It's like us. We're all sitting here saying, oh, globo-homo culture is destroying all of our cultures, so we want to do a new nationalism. We want to create our own new identity. We want to do identity politics and become European right-wing chuds and revive the Europeans. And so we're retroactively trying to engineer, well, what was tradism even like? How would tradism fit with the modern times? We're actually sort of trapped in our circumstance where we have to innovate. We have to flourish a little bit. We have to, put it together based on our circumstance, not really based on how it actually was. And so what came out of this was the proper transition out of Yahwehism into a formal Judaism. This is what Joachim Adler is pointing out. The reason why the archaeological record only shows this transition happen after this Maccabean revolt is because of this. Because they win their state and they establish essentially this new religion that's monotheist, that's focused on circumcision, that's focused on this taboo against pork, that creates this separateness, that creates this strong identity that can resist these homogenizing forces which are now retreating and falling away. And this is where we get to the most controversial intellectual of our four thinkers. This is Russell Gmirkin. Now, he does largely textual analysis, which is probably why people call him fringe an awful lot. He's not grounding it in evidence-based archaeology as much. But Russell claims that the Jewish religion was engineered in the Hellenic Empire by groups of scribes that were going into these urban globo-homo libraries where the Greeks were gathering together all this information and filling these libraries up with these large amounts of books and this highly sophisticated information like Plato on how to create states and how to engineer religions. And they basically read all this stuff, cross-examined it with their own myths, and constructed the foundation of a new religion which was deployed during the Maccabee revolt, which was Judaism. And there's definitely some shapes here that fit. For example, there's Plato's Laws and Plato's Republic, which discuss how to construct a state. The need to take your people's ancient religious stories and morph them into a noble lie. These are Plato's ideas, which will then serve as a motivating high PMFC identity. You need to tell them that the constitutional laws that make up your state were given to you far in the ancient times. This is important to say so people have conviction about them. You need to understand that the first generation might be a bit skeptical, but after that first generation, the new kids will be conditioned and they will believe this. This is all written inside Plato. Plato's like hardcore Machiavelli, how to create and organize, how to string up a state. This is all there. But it gets even better. Let's look at the star of the show, God. Plato had the idea of a monotheistic God. In Timaeus, he discusses how the universe was created. He says that the demiurge, which means the architect, built reality. And the demiurge, according to Plato, is a benevolent and intelligent being, often interpreted as a divine craftsman or a godlike figure. He is described as good and free from jealousy, desiring to make the world as good as possible. The demiurge is eternal and unchanging, existing outside the material world, and he works with reason and intelligence. The demiurge organizes pre-existent chaotic matter into an ordered cosmos using the eternal forms as a blueprint. He shapes the universe to resemble the perfect eternal model of the forms, aiming to make it as beautiful and as good as possible. The demiurge creates the physical world, including the heavens, stars, and living beings, by imposing order on chaos through mathematical proportions and harmony. I've heard of that guy before. That sounds like someone I'm familiar with. Now, the thing with Plato is that most people will say nowadays that, oh yeah, well, Plato figured out the one true God that the Yahwehites had figured out for thousands of years. But we're just after discussing the archaeological and historical problems that suggest that Torah Judaism was put together 100 years after Plato put this stuff down. Remember, Plato came before Alexander. He came before those conquests. The Greek Golden Age comes from 500 BC up until the 350 BC when Alexander rips out into the world. So Plato was already there. He had put this stuff down into pen. And he himself was saying that there was this problem. This is a philosophical conundrum you see throughout Socrates and Plato's writings where, okay, the old gods are clearly sort of mysticism, memories. They're kind of like vague myths that understand reality. But the true reality is this demiurgic creator who's kind of far off in distance. And these mathematical formulae that make up the substance of the world, they're a critical part of reality. And we have an issue where we need to lead people towards this good, these mathematical formulae that were put there by the demiurge that will make things beautiful and strong. But, you know, the people are retarded, so they want their myths. So we have to kind of be the mediators, where we're the enlightened philosopher kings, the priests that lead them towards this idealism. This would have been centerpiece to an awful lot of the highest intellectual work in Alexandria. Alexandria was a giant globo-homo merging and blending of all people all across the world coming and trying to interact with universal truths. It would have been imposing on people this shutting down of the PMFC to open people's minds and make them more liberal, make them more open-minded. Get over your collectivized close-mindedness following your old paganism, and let's join together in Egypt and Alexandria and try to think through what is the true high truths, what is the Platonic philosophical project. And so we have all these people from Judea who would have come into this malaise and seen all this and interacted with this. And so Gmerkin is saying that it was in this moment in Alexandria that scribes from Judea came in and they worked to take their people's old Yahwehistic myths and to modernize them, to make them sophisticated and lead them towards these high goods and say, okay, God came and chose us and wants to lead us from our old ancient tradition with Moses and Exodus towards the good. And that's a completely normal and rational thing. You want to motivate your people as an enlightened scribe towards the good. Who doesn't want to do that? That's fine. So Gmerkin's theory is an alignment between the problem of Elephantine, where we have this Yahwehistic religion, but no Moses, none of this, and then Jonathan Adler pointing out that the archaeology only really kicks off as the Hellenic Empire is falling down. And Gmerkin is pointing out that in between these, there was this moment where the Hebrew texts were translated into Greek, called the Septuagint, where 70 scribes came from Judea, probably sponsored by one of the kings, and they wanted to, construct or formalize their religion. And the point here is that there was no Exodus or no Moses mentioned at any time ever before this date. So we have this problem where these guys come in and they seem to be translating these works, but how do we know that this wasn't the crafting of these works? Sure, they must have taken some documents and some memory of their people and tribal stories, but we've already established that a lot of these stories reveal anachronisms and pieces of engineering. Why can't we assume that something like this took place as well during this well-funded moment? Formalized Judaism with the best ideas around them in the world. And they had every motivation to do this. There was an Egyptian writer who basically said all the Jews were lepers. They were the early forms of lepers. So they're these little gremlin monsters, these golems. And so they're like, wait a second now, right? We can't go around having people say we're these monsters, we're these bad people. So let's go and let's give ourselves a motivating story. Let's go and defend ourselves against this slander calling us decrepits. And so as the theory goes, in the Library of Alexandria, they now had crafted a better national myth, and then right as the Hellenic Empire begins to collapse, they use this to give themselves a strong cultural identity, a rigid and energetic nationalism that says, oh yes, the divine God that Plato talks about in Timaeus, yes, he's real, and we need to reach up towards him, and he has chose us to be mediators to the world. We're not lepers, we're not these monsters, we're actually very important, we're special, we're supposed to be the moral conduits of this, and we should fight for our religion and fight for our people and secure ourselves. And the Maccabees come and say we should have a revolt and claim this territory for ourselves to reestablish our identity and our true religion, our moral religion, against all these degenerates that are all around us. And of course, what happens as the Alexandrian Empire gets weak, as the Hellenics get weak, one of their leaders begins to chimp out. He loses the grace of soft power. He no longer can act persuasive. He has to start using violence. He goes in and tries to bully the Jews, and this stimulates the PMFC. It gets them riled up and angry. And the grace of soft power falls apart, and people start to hate him. They're like, you know what, Maccabees, you're right. Let's chud out against these guys. Screw them. I don't like them anymore. We're up for a fight, and it's a fight that they win. So the minimalist argument hinges on these core pieces of evidence. The Elephantine problem, the Septuagint appearing in the Library of Alexandria, and Adler pointing out that the archaeology is basically running dry before that moment, and the Maccabee revolt, where we know for certain there was huge amounts of pressure on Jewish nationalism from the globo homo force of Hellenism. So the idea here is that the religious project was born in this moment. It was a political innovation at the time that had just been engineered in the great libraries of the world, and it had received much of what came out of the philosophical canon that was there at the time. And this might explain why the next series of events take place in the way they do.